Good evening, everybody. We'll give it just a minute or two for everyone to come in. While that's happening, would you mind just typing really quickly in the chat box the grade level of your students? So as we're talking about these topics tonight, we have an idea of which grade level. Welcome. Okay, so we have a good span. I think we have like every single grade, one parent in every single grade represented. So that's awesome. Maybe not fifth. Yeah, we have fifth. Okay. Great. Well, we'll kind of get started here and then I'll let people in as they join. So, hi everyone. I am Jamie Curtis, the principal at Pinecrest Academy. Thank you for joining us virtually for Popcorn with the Principal. And I'm joined here by Carol Davis, our student behavior specialist.
Hello, everybody.
We're going to first talk about gifted and talented programming and our plans for identifying students at Pinecrest, as well as our plans for that instructional support in the coming year and years. And then we'll spend about 10 to 15 minutes on that topic and then transition over to Miss Davis for her presentation on emotional intelligence, which is really exciting. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you all. So as we go through the presentation and the information, please feel free to write questions in the chat box. And then as we come to points where it makes sense to pause and answer those questions, we will do that. Perfect. All right. So first of all, so gifted and talented programming is something that is designed to meet the needs of our exceptional learners who achieve not just in the classroom, but sometimes they have, um, we'll see these visual spatial traits or artistic talents. So the way that we identify students, we want to make sure we're encompassing different modalities of testing and different ways of looking at their achievement, because exceptional learners in these categories are sometimes, so to speak, all over the map. So they might not be necessarily the strongest reader, the strongest math student, but they might have a combination. They might be a really fast processor. You might see students who think really outside the box and come up with creative solutions, or who can articulate their thinking in a way that, for their age kind of goes above and beyond what their peers are doing. So our process for identifying our gifted and talented students at Pinecrest will be based on identifying them through the Nevada rubric for identifying gifted and talented students. And there's three parts to the rubric. And one is the student's score on different achievement tests. So we use the iReady test. We can also use the SBAC test or MAP test for our younger students as one of those measures. The way that the rubric plays out and the points that are allocated for each of those different components, it really makes the most sense, and we are able to identify and kind of streamline that testing process for students who test in the 95th percentile and above. Oftentimes, the 98th percentile and above is awarded the most points in that category for the achievement test, but we pull that down to the 95th percentile for identification for testing. So that's the first piece that we'll be looking at as a school. Is after spring testing, we'll be looking at student achievement and looking for students who achieved either on math or reading or science if they're in fifth grade and the 95th percentile or above. The second piece that we will then do is invite those students to come sit for the COGAT test. That will happen over the summer. So students will come to school for a COGAT session. It's a computer test, and there's three different components of the COGAT test. We are looking, we don't there's two different ways to approach the COGAT test. There's a screener test, and then there's actually the full battery test. So what we're going to do is not administer the screener, but we're going to identify students who achieve in the 95th percentile or higher and invite them to come in for the full battery test. There's three components of the COGAT test, and so you might, if you have a student that you think might be, in this category of an exceptional learner through gifted education, You might be thinking of any of these three different parts and know that they're all, they get a score in each of these three categories. So the first part is a verbal, and the students participate in an activity that gives them picture analogies. So they have to match, kind of like you would do on the SAT test, make comparisons. They have a sentence completion task that they do in a picture classification test. And that verbal test is designed for us to capture students who have those exceptionalities in the verbal fields. The other component is the quantitative battery, and this is more for students. Now they will, to clarify, they will take all three when they do the COGAT test, and they get a separate score in each of the batteries. So the quantitative includes number analogies, number puzzles, and number series. So they look for patterns in numbers and identify like what number would come next in a series and things like that. Analogies based on numbers. The last piece is the nonverbal battery, and this is the piece that has like figure matrices, paper folding, figure classifications. It's students who can look at like an object laid out and be able to visualize what the three-dimensional equivalent would be. So the COGAT test we will utilize because it is so comprehensive, and our hope is to capture exceptionalities across all three of these realms. So once the students are invited to sit for the COGAT test, they'll take that test, they get a score in each of those batteries, and then they get an overall score. And then we have a rubric, so we measure, they get a certain number of points based on their achievement score, and then they get a certain number of points based on their COGAT score. The third category would pertain to us trying to make sure that we're identifying all different types of learners. So, for example, students who also qualify for special education, who have an IEP. So those students would be considered dual exceptional. What we would do in that case is they get some bonus points. So students, for example, who are English language learners get some bonus points. There's a few different categories that students kind of get an extra point or two just to make sure that we're looking at the matrix and giving equitable access to all students, and kind of thinking about, you know, what other constraints might be going on to them processing and performing well on those different tests. They get that an entire score based on the Nevada State rubric, at which point they get the sort of identification of falling into gifted and talented education. The way that we will do this is that going into next year, students will have students who have qualified. So either, and I get this question a lot, so if students had previously qualified in the district, they don't have to go through the process again. We have those records in Infinite Campus. We can pull those up and look in their transfer records. So if they already took that in Washoe County, they take the Naglieri test. So if they took that, they were identified, that transfers over to us, then they will also qualify to start receiving services. For our students next year in grades K through 5, it will be some enrichment in the classroom and some pull-out instruction with the gifted and talented teacher. In grades 6 through 8, it will be one of their elective choices if they want to. So sometimes in middle school, the students are already taking differentiated classes when they're exceptional learners, so they might be taking a higher level math class or be in a tiered ELA novel study. So they don't have to take that elective, but they'll be invited to take it if they would like. So I hope that makes sense. The timeline for that will be, we finish all of our achievement tests, including SBAC, MAP, and iReady by the end of May. We'll have those 95th percentile and above scores. We sort through those scores. We have a letter that we'll send home electronically to you all to let you know that your student scored in that percentile and has been identified to take the COGAT test. Just like, just keep in mind, you have a choice. So if you are not interested in having your student falls in that 95th or above, but you don't want them to take the COGAT test or work towards identification, you don't have to. So there will be a little option on there for you to say, yes, I'd like to schedule a session, or no, thank you, we're good. Or there's another place for you to indicate for some students who maybe transferred from a different system, like maybe they were in a public school in another state, those records wouldn't have transferred. So you can also let us know at that time that you had a gifted and talented identification from another school that you want to provide documentation for. And typically you would have received a letter from that school. Hopefully you still have it somewhere and you could send it over to us. Then they wouldn't have to go through the COGET screening process again. So this will be primarily, this initial screening will be primarily for for students finishing kindergarten, or not kindergarten, sorry, first grade at the end of this year, not kindergarten. Although we can do the assessment for kindergarten, we're going to focus this one on first grade for this first time, first grade and up. So students in first grade through seventh grade will have the opportunity to take the test and go through that process. One other thing to keep in mind is we don't want to miss anybody. Sometimes students are exceptional learners. They have, students are all unique and have exceptionalities in all kinds of different ways. And so if your student, didn't score in the 95th percentile or above, but you really see some unique traits that indicate to you that your student might be one that would qualify for gifted and talented, you can reach out to your teacher and let them know that you would like to have your student participate in the COGET. That's totally fine. And likewise, the teachers have an opportunity also to recommend students even if they don't meet that achievement measure. And the purpose of that just is that some students, even though they might be exceptional learners and in all these things, they might not show that on those types of achievement tests, but they might score so on the COGET test. Just so I put this out there, students who don't score above the 95th percentile have to have a nearly flawless score on the COGET in order to qualify. So it's very few students that fall into that category, but it does happen and we don't want to miss anybody. So I know that's a lot of information. When I send the video link to this, I'll also send that summary that has the process and timeline along with the state rubric so you can kind of see what that looks like. I'm also working with a education liaison who provides gifted and talented support and working on getting, my goal is to have a teacher trained in each grade level to be the GT support teacher in each grade level. So I'm hoping that we can also provide that piece as well for our students next year. So I hope that helps clarify some questions that you have around gifted and talented for next year, what our plan is, what that's going to look like. And if you have any questions, I am happy to pause before we shift over to Miss Davis and answer those at this time. So if they scored on the Kaufman test and they qualified, Kelsey, and you have that qualification letter, then you can send that over to me and that will suffice. So as long as they scored, and if it was out of state or somewhere else and they got the qualification letter, you can send that over. They won't have to test again. Good question. Yeah, the state of Nevada doesn't have a mandated assessment tool. So there's the Naglieri, the Kaufman, the COGET. There's a few different tools and different schools and districts choose different tests for different reasons. So that's totally fine.
Jamie, just for clarification, this is Claudia. So
Hi.
you're saying that these are tests that will be provided for first graders and above. So if our kindergarten students are going into first grade, would they be, or is it until the following year?
Normally it's going to be the following year, but we are working with the teachers. So there is the possibility for us to have that pull out in first grade next year too. It's not typical to give the COGET test to kindergarteners just because just developmental capacity and sitting through the test, it's quite long. It can be sometimes 3 hours long and things like that. So they can, if you really want them to this year, we can go for that, but typically it's going to be next year.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Good question. What about kids who score high on math and low in reading? Will they qualify or do they have to be gifted in both areas? They don't have to score high in both areas. So the way that the Nevada rubric works is that achievement score can be in either math, reading, or science. So it doesn't have to be in both. And quite commonly, students score high in one and not in the other, and that's totally fine. It's usually also reflected in how they perform on the COGET test. So, for example, students who score higher in math are typically going to score higher on the quantitative battery, and students who score higher in reading are going to score higher on the verbal battery on the COGAT. So we usually see a correlation there. They get independent scores again for those batteries, so it's not uncommon that they can qualify being really strong in one area and not the other. It's a great question. Again, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to email me. I'm really excited to get this programming going for our students. Excited about how things are rolling out with access to the coursework for our teachers and bringing our students in to do this work over the summer too. So very excited. Okay, so we will just pause for a minute and transition over to Miss Davis. I wanted Miss Davis Carroll to start out with giving us a little bit of background about her work in behavioral science and kind of go through her journey of what brought her to working as a behavior specialist with students, what that looks like, and then talk to us about emotional intelligence. So, Miss Davis, the floor is yours, and you are muted, just so you know. Okay.
Okay, guys. Well, first of all, it's nice to see some familiar names and some faces on here. I began my journey, I studied my Master's of Education and Behavioral Science. For those who are not so familiar with that, that would be an emphasis in psychology and sociology. I started my career as an associate professor in sociology, working at university, and also was the assistant athletic director and head coach at that college. I noticed as athletes came through the ranks that I really started to see some deficiencies emotionally or behaviorally with entitlement, just different things that really affected them on the field. And having that background in behavior, I had the great opportunity to switch careers at that point to really affect change. I knew it had to be done earlier in students' development. So I shifted gears altogether, stepped out of college and stepped right into the elementary school system. My first job actually started off as an in-school suspension classroom, and I didn't like that either because I felt that we were reacting to behaviors instead of trying to help with programming and giving students the tools they needed to be successful. So we changed that program altogether. We done more programming and push in supports. My job quickly evolved to behavior liaison, to where I was putting behavior plans in place for students to, again, help them stay in the classroom and do what they needed to do to be successful. And I shifted from behavior liaison to behavior coach, to where I was working with teachers and helping teachers deal with behaviors that were displayed in their classroom spaces. So I love behavior. I love everything about this population of students. Behavior is just communication. And it's difficult to read at times, and like any other skill that we need in life, it's a skill that has to be taught. So that's what brings me around to today's topic, talking about emotional intelligence and competency. For me, starting this year, you really see it more in kindergarten level, but you can see a trend coming up through the grade levels, that some of our students maybe haven't been taught the skills, or they haven't known how to express themselves in a moment of behavior, or they're struggling with anxiety. And as we go through this presentation, hopefully we can look to bridge that gap between the school environment and our home, and look to see what we can do to support that with our students. If you are a parent of a middle schooler, this is not going to be lost on you. I've broken the presentation down into 3 specific areas, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So there is going to be information that will be valuable for you as well. So did that shift across there, your side, Miss Curtis? Yeah. So just some norms for meetings. Again, you may be a rock star parent, and you may have things that you can contribute to the group. Have a growth mindset with information that you're learning. If you are sitting there quietly and you do have input, please reach out and speak. Put your information in the chat. We'll talk about that in a little bit later. builders versus bulldozers. If anybody has got information to contribute to the group, please build them up and be grateful for that information. This is not a platform to put anybody down. If you have a specific situation that's going on with your student, either at home or within the school, please know that this is not a time to discuss that personal specific situation, but I'm more than happy to help. So please do reach out via email, and my contact information will be presented at the end of this presentation. And again, I'm going to have to move my little people. Our chat box is a great place for you to throw questions in so that they're not lost as we move through the presentation. I do have some natural pauses put in place so that we can have some dialogue, but don't let it escape you. Please go on ahead and jump in that chat box. So again, talked about our learning intention, our learning objectives. Part 1, we're going to look to understand emotional intelligence and emotional competence. Part 2, thank you. Part 2, we'll be looking at 3 steps that you can take to help build that emotional competency at home. And part 3 will be bridging the gap. What can we do until the EI skills are developed? So part 1. So looking at competency versus intelligence. Some people think they're kind of cross-related. Some people think they're exclusive, but they're very much intertwined. Emotional competency is actually looking at the application of emotional intelligence. And then when we look at emotional intelligence, we're looking to understand, use, and manage those skills to be able to help deal with anxiety, stress, anger, empathize, and look at all of those things together so that we're able to be more aware and help regulate those skills. Taking those definitions and stating it in a little bit more of a simple format for you guys, it's looking to understand our emotions. Basically, we're looking to train our children to be self-aware. What is that I'm feeling? Why am I feeling that way, and acknowledging that, and that's again has to be taught. Understand that this does not mean that we're wanting our students to share every single thing they're feeling and that they feel like they have to admit this stuff to us. They do not. It is just being able to label it, acknowledge it, and then to be able to problem solve on the back end. So again, this is not something that should feel awkward or embarrassing for our students. Throughout our presentation, I'm just going to take some moments of pause as I throw up a quote. There will be a book I'll share with you at the end. It is absolutely brilliant by Knoy that really goes into detail looking at emotional intelligence and really looking at it from the parent's perspective. So as they throw up, we're just going to pause, let you read them, let you reflect. If you have a question in relation to that, please feel free to throw it in the chat box. But there is some great information coming through those little tidbits as we press forward. So this is what it would look like if you look at the characteristics of someone who has low emotional intelligence and someone who's high emotional intelligence. And it's interesting as we read through this, as you are sitting there as an adult yourself, it's reading through and looking at these traits that you have as an individual that really places you in that position of, do you have high emotional intelligence, do you have low? An example of that. And again, if you think of a behavior that even you yourself have, are you warm, enthusiastic, sociable? Are you patient? Are you consistent? Do you think you're an active listener when it comes to problem solving strategies? Or are you aggressive? Do you jump to conclusions? Do you react? Are you resistant to change? And I think sometimes when you look at this, it's hard for us to feel, well, I'm not as high emotionally as I may have thought I was, but that is okay. Not all of these are exclusive, but they are traits that tell us that we may need to look in and develop those skills a little bit more. And we definitely want to make sure that we're helping our students and our children. Anybody who's on this call that knows me is I am not a fixer of problems. I like to facilitate a dialogue with our students to help teach them the skills to be able to deal with anything life throws at them. I like that strategy because instead of them just being compliant and doing, they're in that process and we're teaching them. Again, everything's learned. And again, the reaction on the back end can be learned as well. I love that quote. So as we looked at, are we low intelligence, are we high? Again, I want to let you know, this is not a rating scale, and there are rating scales out there, and there's different studies out there that do have them available. You're able to jump online and find them in many places. But these are just some questions that as you process with your child, you're able to identify where they need support. Can they pick out their own clothes? Do they try to comfort you as a parent when you're upset and you're crying? Do they follow group rules? Are they impulsive? Or do they keep going? Do they have that resilience when something is difficult, or are they discouraged and want to step back? So when we're trying to decipher where they are in relation to those coping strategies, lists like this are really, really helpful as we shift forward. So we know what category to put them in. And we're going to talk about those categories in a little minute. I love these moments of pause because I know everybody's eyes are just scanning along, following the sentences. I see some teachers online with us. Thank you very much and welcome. This is a natural skill that most of our teachers have. I love this because it's embedded in who they are as people and partly why they become educators. Whenever we talk about feedback for students, and we talk about feedback not only on the academic side, but we're looking at that behavior modification, we want to be very specific with feedback, and our teachers are amazing at this. So it's not just good job. It is not just saying, I like that. It is, I loved how you wrote your name nice and cleanly, and it's on top of that road or on top of that line. So it's giving that feedback back so that our students are able to repeat that behavior or repeat that academic success moment. So that's why we want to be very specific when we throw out those evaluations about words. So I talked about that framework where we were going to look at that in a bit more detail. The top of my screen is actually cutting off the top. I hope it's not like that for you. But we're going to look at the framework and then we're going to jump into in a little bit more detail. So self-awareness, and this is something that I use a lot in my behavior modification programs for especially top tier 2 and tier 3. Self-awareness, some students are absolutely not aware of their bodies, of how they're presenting, how they're coming across. It has an effect on their moods, emotions, an effect on their performance within the space. Regulation is the other side. Regulation is the ability to control those moods or control those things that are affecting them. If you can just remember, guys, to stay on mute, everybody can then hear. I would really appreciate that. Thank you. Jumping into self-motivation. This is a tough one. This is self-motivation. This is looking at intrinsic reasons to be motivated for doing something. So we're not always handing that quarter for doing something in the house because we have responsibilities at home and we expect our children to help with those home responsibilities. And it's flipping that terminology away from $1 for a chore. You're going to take care of your responsibilities at home because we all have responsibilities within our house, whether it is cleaning your station at dinner time, whether that is putting your clothes in the hamper. I like to use those terms instead of using that external motivation, which is $1 or ice cream or those kind of things. So that's a hard skill to develop, but is really, really important. Moving on to empathy. The emotional makeup of other people. I'm a very empathetic person. I'm somebody that you could share a problem with and I will cry with you. This is my toddler. I have a 5-year-old or 6-year-old now because he just had a birthday. A 6-year-old and a 3-year-old. And my 3-year-old is so tuned in to my emotional status. So if he crawls up, and I almost pause, so if he crawls up and gives me a hug and he wants to get down and move across, he will check to see the emotion on my face, to see if I need extra time in that embrace, or if I'm good to go. And he does that every time he embraces me. And I love that moment of pause. Is there sometimes where I put on that emotional face to help teach him how to read someone else's emotion? Yeah, I do. And do I get a few extra minutes of snuggles? Yes, I do. And I love it. But I love that he's so tuned in empathetically to my feelings. That's such an important skill as we grow up. That skill is really needed as we turn to apologize and take responsibilities for our behavior. But again, that's one of those points for the framework. Social skills, we're going to talk a little bit more social skills in a few moments. We're going to look at that within a group, and we're going to look at that as an individual. So I'm going to just hold that, but it is obviously finding common ground to build rapport between two individuals or a group. Kapura, if you're online, this looks like your boys, so I added this slide. I love this quote. So if you guys know anything about Pinecrest, you know that we are looking at the healthy habits for happy kids. And one of our habits talks about win-win. And when we look at solving problems, we want to look at it being a win-win for all parties. How can we both get something out of this interaction? And it's not so much of a win-lose. When we start to process things like that and look at that, it's really beneficial as we move forward to problem solve and conflict resolution in the classroom, at home, with siblings, with peers, with cousins. It's such an important skill. I love that quote. So I talked a few minutes ago about looking at what the framework looks like. It's easier to break it up into two sections. We're going to look at personal competence, and we're going to look at social competence. Can it be recognized, and can it be regulated? So there's actually two parts as we shift forward. And this is where a lot of my behavior plans live heavily. And I have some teachers online that are like, yep, I see this, I use this, the students use it. Looking at personal competence, first of all, that self-awareness and recognition. Part of that is just the confidence to be able to do that and step forward. Are they aware of their emotional state? I'm going to pause for a minute and talk about an example. And that will come in. We're going to look at problem solving, some of these examples as we move forward in the presentation. But I remember my now 6-year-old having a tantrum. The only real tantrum he's ever had, honestly, was because he wanted to help empty the dishwasher, but the knives and steak knives and bread knives were all sticking up. So obviously we talk about how we talk to our children and have them process and understand, but when he wanted to help, he was told no, so that ensued this tantrum on the floor. I'm sure behind those screens, I'm seeing some nodding heads of agreement. What we didn't do was sit down to problem solve and process that. Was he aware that he was kicking? It was a textbook tantrum, kicking on the floor, crying. And again, like I said, this is the only tantrum my now 6-year-old has had. But taking the time to go, oh, you want to help? Well, let's talk about that for a minute, because right now, look in there and tell me if there's anything that you think is dangerous. So there's ways that we can process through that information so that they can understand that, because ultimately what we want is we want them to recognize, obviously we want to live in the preventative world, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, but we really want them to recognize, does my emotion match with the problem? And that's somewhere where we live specifically whenever we're looking at regulating that emotion. Did he need to kick and scream because mommy and daddy's trying to keep him safe from the knives? Possibly not, but is he aware of that? Does he have the skills? Does he develop to really understand that? No, he is not. So that's where as parents and educators, we take the pause to really see how we can help the students recognize that, recognize, does it really match what the problem is? But more importantly, how can we regulate that? And we're going to talk a little bit later on about how we can look at those skills and process through those. Looking over again, I talked about managing those. We're going to talk about strategies we can do to create those. When we look at social competency, we have to master personal competence first. It's really important that they can take care of themselves and their body. You've probably heard the term of someone interacting and going, I hear what you're saying, but I need you to take care of you. You need to, this is a moment where I'm going to talk to this other student. I see some smirks. You need to take care of you. And that's so important that we understand how to take care of our own selves first, before we look and see that how we are aware and how we can regulate in a group of peers. And that's like a second level to problem solving and handling conflict and all of the things that come with friendships. Again, I love these quotes. And we're going to shift across to part 2. And we're going to talk about what we can do. What does it look like? This is great information. It's a lot of information. It may be too much information. I try to simplify it as much. And wanted to really focus on what does this look like to me as a mom? What does this look like to me as a dad? And what can I do with that information at home? I hope that these quotes are really causing you to pause and really reflect on some interactions that you're able to have with your students or with your children. So we're going to look at a 3-step process. We're going to look, and you're going to hear it throughout the middle section of this presentation. Step 1, we want to name that emotion. We want them to be able to recognize it. Step 2 is you need to acknowledge that and validate that feeling. We don't have to agree with how they're feeling. We often know that the emotion doesn't match with the issue at hand, but it really is important that we acknowledge how they're feeling. Step 3, then we move into that problem solving phase so we can rationalize how we back plan to our emotion that is displayed. We'll talk about that in a bit more detail. And again, anybody that knows me knows that I love logical and natural consequences for behavior. It really helps a student understand, and an example of a logical or natural consequence in behavior may be that they have gotten frustrated at the table and they've accidentally knocked their milk cup over on the floor. Well, while we understand that they were upset about something, they still have a responsibility to maintaining your home and keeping everything clean. So after we acknowledge the behavior and understand that they were so upset, we still have to shift to take responsibility for actions. And the natural consequence for that would be cleaning up the milk off the floor. Understand that they may not be able to do that until they are happy and they've felt loved and they're ready to go. So jumping into step 1, a little bit more detail. Again, when we go into dialogue with our children, that may be something like, I see that you are sad and I'm mad and you just want to scream, yell, and cry. I understand that, right? Or it may be that they're shouting at their sibling and you're like, oh, I see that you're frustrated. Let's talk about that. The words that you're using are automatically going to have them start to recognize the alignment, because as you have dialogue with your students or with your children, that you're using those emotional terms to line them up. My children from a very young age were able to say, under 2 years old, that they were frustrated. And when you start off labeling, it really allows you to move forward and shift into problem solving status quo. Why is that important? Again, naming it can diffuse the charge. It helps them really start to align that, and they can step back to make choices. What do I do with this feeling of being mad? Or what can I do when I'm frustrated? Step 2, we talked about acknowledging it. It's really important. Again, the need to be understood and troubleshoot those emotions. We have to acknowledge it. Again, I understand that there's times where you may think it just does not match. Why are they reacting? They are overreacting, but it doesn't mean that you have to agree with it. But yes, they need to know that you're empathizing, that you are understanding of why they're feeling that way, and then you can shift to that problem solving. Why is it important? Again, they develop empathy from experience that from us. So when I talked to my child because he couldn't get into the dishwasher because the knives were poking out, it is able to, like, yeah, I want you to help, but we can get to that position to where we make it safe, and then you can help with our family responsibilities. Step 3, again, I talked before about behavior is communication. Emotions are messages. They're something that should be listened to, but we have to learn how to problem solve. So he may be disappointed that he didn't get to empty the dishwasher and he displayed his behavior in a full-on tantrum. But having dialogue about what we can do. Okay, so you want to empty the dishwasher, and mommy has already described that it's actually not safe for you to help right now. What can we do together so you can help? Do you want to wait until we're finished? Is there something we can do to help right now so that you can assist? Is there another job? So it's going into a dialogue. Yes, can you do that with a 2-year-old? Absolutely. So don't be afraid to step in and see what they have to say. You may be very, very surprised at those solutions that come out of these little mouths. These are still techniques that you can use with your high schoolers. An example in the book that I'm going to describe later actually talks about looking at curfew times as a parent, and how that we have this big problem when a teenage daughter doesn't think that it's appropriate. Well, a way to prevent the tantrums and the arguments is to actually sit down and go, okay, do you know why that I think this should be your curfew time? Let's discuss it. Why do you think as a parent that's important for me? Let's discuss why you think it should be extended, and see if it isn't, if we do want to come to a happy medium, or no, you understand that I want you in at this time. Maybe it's because it's a school night, maybe it's because of safety, night lights. That's something you can get into dialogue and problem solve, but the 3 steps can still be used for your middle schooler as well. Touch base on that. And when I look at this quote, I talked a little bit earlier about corrective consequences and really aligning them to help teach our young students to grow and develop. Something that we've implemented recently with peers that are having conflict at a minor level is that we've created a buddy walk system to where maybe it's more appropriate for these 2 individuals that had conflict between them to actually work on a prompt together and have dialogue and discuss the problem, see if they can solve the problem together. So putting them into those situations, as long as both parties are safe and both parties feel content, it does help them learn about the other person and see what maybe they're dealing with or why they have that perspective. A movie that really touches on this is Remember the Titans. I love, obviously, as my background in coaching, I love a good coaching movie, and Remember the Titans does an absolute great job of teaching this. So part 3, bridging the gap. Whenever they're not quite developed, again, as I processed how to help parents and help our students progress, it's great that we know what we need to do. It's great that we know what emotional intelligence competency is. But what if it's not there? What if it's just not there? And I'm trying to help? Well, we're going to shift and touch base on it. Behavior, and this is the best analogy. I use it every year. I use it in my teacher's training. The behavior that we see is literally the peak of that iceberg. We talked about it's communication. It is how they're telling us that there's an issue. What we don't see is everything underneath that water surface, whether it is sleep, whether it is food, whether it is emotions, thoughts, stresses. Once we understand what is behind the behavior displayed, that's what drives us to really align the best approach to be able to help our students or help our children. So when we look at the conflict cycle, this is something that we have to understand as adults, that we have the cognitive ability to have pause and control, and we can look at the situation differently. And I always talk about the conflict cycle because we talk about a trigger that starts off a stressful situation. And I'm going to have an example of what this can look like in a few minutes. Then they internalize what that trigger was, and then we see what they outpour to us. At that pivotal point right there, it is our job to either stop and mitigate it, or we can make a choice that keeps it rolling. And I think we've all been guilty of being in a situation with our own personal children that has escalated them to a different level because we've been in a frustrated state. Now, I understand this is ideal situation, right? But it doesn't mean that we don't have those moments where we don't pause and reflect. But it is crucial that we pause and try to bring that behavior back down so that we can regulate that emotion that we talked about, that we can bring awareness to it, and then we shift to that point 3 of that problem solving. And I'm going to have a few examples here as we step forward. Hopefully these quotes, as they keep coming, draw you into how we look at behavior. So we're going to talk a little bit of an example. Again, I'm going to be really brief and try to make this realistic without jumping into too much of the science. An antecedent is something that happens before the behavior is displayed. So it's something that triggers your student, triggers your child. An example I've used here is you tell your son to stop playing the video game and do homework. The son in this particular example, he verbally complains, tries to bargain for extra time, but he ultimately ignores you. But the consequence of that, the unintended consequence, is that homework's not completed. Now, I'm sure if we broke down our interactions with our students and our children, that we can see the ABCs of behavior quite clearly. We talked about, again, my purpose of this section of the presentation is what do we do when they're not emotionally there? So then look at this from a different perspective. Again, the antecedent, I'm going to take that same situation, but I'm going to tell my son that we've got 10 minutes and then it's going to be homework time. But during that 10 minutes, I'm giving multiple reminders. We've got 5 minutes, remember 5 minutes, and then we're going to do your homework. We've got 1 minute left. So if you want to prepare yourself to get packed up, the behavior displayed to the antecedent here would be that he packs his computer up and begins to work. And the consequence of this is homework is completed. So again, as we talk about, maybe they're not quite there emotionally, maybe they're not regulated or aware, but as a parent, we can flip that terminology to help set them up for success at home as best we can to be able to have that outcome or that stage 3 that we talked about in problem solving. And here you can see the definite difference between how we approach the situation to help our students that maybe aren't emotionally competent. Oh, this was the example I talked about earlier. So again, you can turn any of these examples for any age levels as we progress and look at emotional intelligence. Some things that you can do at home, obviously we talked about it, we've learned what it's like, we've talked about different approaches, but what resources are available to you as a parent to help your students and help your children? These are some of the favorite books. These are all in my office. I use books a lot to teach skills, to help teach those moments. Again, it's fun, it's nice. You probably heard of zones of regulation. That's something that's used in a lot of educational settings. These are just fun ways for us to look at identifying, labeling, and learning to regulate our behaviors. In the email sent earlier, this is a book list. I thought I'd put together a quick list for you of books that you can use as resources to help your kids. If there is a specific behavior that you are looking help with at home, please do email me. I probably have a book for you, and I can help guide you to the best resources for that. Something I love to do with my children is to use game night as the opportunity to, again, teach. Obviously, I do a lot of work with my students, game related, because it does draw them in and does pull them together to be able to be committed and be able to hear and learn in a different format. And these are some examples of some games. Again, you can jump online and find some games that may suit you and your family, but having a game night really does serve a few different purposes, not only the learning, but it does bring you guys together and help the communication. Again, this is your final slide kind of reminder. What's our takeaways from today? Remember, when it comes to emotions, we want to name it. We must acknowledge it, whether we feel that it's valid or not, and we want to shift to problem solve and rationalize a response. These are some quotes to finish. This is a sad quote for me because it happens, guys. We talk about that growth mindset, but I'm going to tell you that a student that doesn't feel that they can do one tiny thing, it can explode. One of the books was on a slide a few minutes ago, talked about bubblegum brain. It's a great example of how we have that growth mindset, and we learn and we try and we continue to be resilient. But this does happen, and it's really quite sad. So. And I see some nodding heads, because if we fix every single problem that our children face, whether that be peer interaction at school, whether that be they forgot their lunch, if we fix it all, we're not helping them learn those skills to be able to carry forward. So please remember that. Here is my contact information if anybody wants to reach out. And I'm just going to show you guys two books. The quotes came from this book. I love it, Emotional Intelligent Children. And a parenting book that I absolutely love. And I'm trying, I should probably put these in the slide. But Danish Way of Parenting, a book that I read years ago as I started my career, talked about looking at toddler tantrums, and the Danish actually look at it as not tantrums, that it's just little children, mini humans, exploring their limits and their boundaries. So when you hear how things are rephrased, again, two fantastic books that can really help with how we parent positively to help the growth of our children. And that is it for my presentation. Has anybody got any questions, or any questions were put in the chat? I like to talk. I'm Irish. I can't help myself.
I don't see any questions in the chat, but we can certainly pause for anyone who wants to unmute themselves and ask a question.
I hope everybody's still awake, first of all.
It's interesting, Carol. One thing that I always think about with this is, we deal as educators, we cover these topics every single day. We work with all different kinds of students and all different kinds of behaviors. And sometimes it's hard as a parent to know what you're seeing in your child, because that's maybe sometimes one of the only children that you're working with. Is what they're doing within the realm of what's, where does my child fall on that scale? What are your thoughts for someone who's kind of asking themselves that question? Who's like,
that's a really quick question, and it's hard to really quantify that, because if you don't have that comparison, understand that emotional competence, as I said at the beginning, like emotional intelligence, that's something that has to be taught. It's a skill just like anything other. If you were unable to get through a grocery store shop without having multiple tantrums, email me and let's talk. But the labeling it, talking about it, and doing all those things from our end, if you have not done that as a parent, there's no limit to that. Kids by the age of 7 to 8 should have emotional regulation down. They should be able to label. They should be able to be aware of that. And if they do not, and you're sitting there listening to this presentation and you're thinking, my child's a lot older, and we're not quite there with the regulation, then that's something that you may want to, yes, you can reach out and talk, but that may be something you want to reach out and talk to your pediatrician about.
Thank you so much, Carol, for sharing your expertise with us. We are so excited and appreciate it very much. So Thank you for putting all that together. I love the quotes too, so we might have
Oh,
to pull some of those out.
I
Kind
love
of.
I love them. I like that it even paused. It really makes you think and
Yeah.
process how we approach things as parents. And I myself love it. So yeah.
Thank you so much for taking the time to meet with us. Thank you for your flexibility to shift to as full virtual. Um, the benefits of Zoom and the virtual stuff sometimes make it easy to jump on these from on the go. So thank you for taking the time. We appreciate you. And yes, thank you, Carol. You're amazing. Yeah.